Today we have a collection of expressions that you may not be finding in the content that you are consuming. These are expressions you may have trouble wrapping your head around until you get more familiar with them. Now, we're not starting a new trend toward memorizing lists of vocabulary. No, that's not the plan. This is a group of expressions, a baker's dozen to be more precise, expressions given to you in micro stories. I am Joseph, and this is Input English. Let's get started. I already said the first one, baker's dozen. You may have heard that term, maybe not. So let's start with dozen, because that's the basis of this. In English, we've used the word dozen for centuries. It comes originally from Mesopotamia. Now, as you know, most of the numbering systems that we encounter in the modern world are base 10. And it's not an accident. We have 10 fingers and our numbering system is base 10. But in Mesopotamia, they looked at their hand and they saw 4 fingers, not counting the thumb, and each finger had 3 bones, and so that gave them a sum of 12. And this was the basis of the numbering system that was base 12 used in Mesopotamia. And that many things, 12 things, was a dozen. Now we use a dozen now mostly in commerce, and it's not used very often. There are things in the United States that are typically sold by the dozen. In years past, a lot more was sold by the dozen. In the 21st century, if you buy something by the dozen, it's probably going to be eggs or cookies, donuts, shrimp, oysters, some vegetables. Most vegetables are sold by the pound, but you may see some things sold by the dozen. Roses are typically sold by the dozen. So if you go into a store and you say, I'd like a dozen donuts, you're going to get 12. If you are in a restaurant and you order a half a dozen oysters, you're going to get 6. So now that we've got a dozen, what is this baker's dozen? That dates back to England, the Middle Ages, and it was fear-based. The king was confounded that there was dishonesty in the marketplace, and he chose to regulate that. So he issued an edict that if a merchant shorts someone, cheats them, then that merchant could be subjected to public flogging. Now, by modern standards, in the Middle Ages in England, punishments were very harsh. Felonies like murder, manslaughter, arson, rape, burglary, those were all capital crimes. Those were felonies, and they were death sentences. Later in the Middle Ages, long prison terms were substituted for some of those death sentences. But by modern standards, jurisprudence of the Middle Ages was super harsh. And then punishment for misdemeanors, the minor crimes, was less severe, but still by modern standards, quite harsh. So if a merchant was to cheat a customer and was convicted of that, a flogging could be given. They could be given a fine. Their property could be seized, or they could get a short prison sentence. Harsh by modern standards. So in that era of the Middle Ages, the merchants didn't want to be flogged. So they created the baker's dozen, that is, each dozen they sold had 13 pieces in it. That way, if there was some sort of investigation of their practices, they had insurance that there was an extra piece. In case of a small mistake, there was an extra piece to ensure they would not be flogged. Some merchants actually put 14 pieces to a dozen. They just didn't want to get flogged. You will hear the term dozen commonly used for the quantity 12, and less commonly you will hear people refer to a baker's dozen, frequently with a smile. In human endeavor and human interaction, there are a lot of circumstances where there is some disagreement. People can disagree. They can be skeptical, or they can be surprised. And interactions of this type have created expressions that come up in English and will be useful to you to at least understand them, if not to use them. The first one is a classic: shut up. Shut up in English is an aggressive thing to say. You're shouting an instruction at someone. You're issuing a strong instruction for that person to stop talking. Most of us consider shut up incredibly rude and aggressive. To make it clear, I have not told another person to shut up in my adult life. It never happens. You may see it. The most common place you will see someone say shut up would be a child or an immature adult who's very angry. Now that used to be the case, but then popular culture got a hold of that expression, and now there's a new use for that old expression. I was at work several years ago, and one of my junior associates, one of my colleagues at work, was listening, and I was talking and explaining something, can't remember what, and when I finished, she said, "Oh, shut up." Now, she said it with a smile, and what she didn't mean was for me to stop talking. What she meant was she was surprised. So popular culture has kind of reissued shut up. And so if you hear it, you may hear it in a lighthearted way where someone is expressing astonishment or surprise. Now, there are lots of ways to tell people to stop talking. There are variants of shut up. Shut your mouth. Shut your face. Those are pretty aggressive. Adults best avoid saying them to each other because it can lead to great conflict if you choose that aggressive a posture. There is a way to simmer it down a little bit, and that's to say hush. The word hush just means quiet. And so if you talk to somebody and you say hush or hush up, that means to quiet down or stop talking, but it doesn't have the aggressiveness of shut up. It still is an instruction, and it still can offend, but it's much less likely to offend than telling someone to shut up. In previous videos, I pointed out that English, originating in England and in the US, is heavily influenced by nautical terms. And we've talked about that. Here's another nautical term that has come into English and is used currently in English. And that is another term for telling someone to quiet down or stop talking: pipe down. So in a nautical setting, instructions were given to the crew with a bosun's pipe, a whistle. And they would pipe the instructions with this shrill, loud whistle. And when the crew heard the instruction, they would respond. And so there was a whistle call that the crew knew for quiet down, and the instruction was called pipe down. So if you are talking to somebody and they're either too loud or they're saying things that you don't want to hear, you can say pipe down. You're still giving an instruction telling someone to be quiet. It's still a little aggressive, but not as bad as shut up. So those were expressions we used when we wanted to stop somebody from talking because there's disagreement. So what if there's skepticism or doubt? How do you express that? Somebody is telling you something that just sounds very strange, very far-fetched, very odd. You might listen for a while and then say, oh, come on. Another phrasal verb, oh, come on, meaning you're not buying it. You're not believing what they are saying. Expressing skepticism. Along those lines, you might hear someone say, you're putting me on, suggesting that you're trying to deceive them or you're trying to tell them things that are simply not true. You're putting me on. Oh, come on. Now, if somebody is speaking with you and you're not believing what they're saying, but you realize that it may just be that you haven't completely understood it yet, and that there might be a point at which their explanation would make sense, you might say, go on, meaning you're receptive to hearing more, but it has an air of skepticism. It just means you're not quite with them yet on that information that they're giving you. So let's say instead of being receptive of what they're telling you, you disagree. You can say, hold on, which means stop. Stop talking. I'm not buying it. Hold on, of course, has other meanings like wait a moment. Along the same lines, someone is telling you something and you're just not believing what they're telling you. You could say, I'm not going to fall for that. It means that you have discerned that you don't believe them. You're rejecting their argument. You're rejecting what they have told you. Very similar to that, if somebody is giving you a plan, an instruction, or an explanation, and you say, you can leave me out of that. You've just said you don't want to be involved. Again, it's a rejection of the argument or the plan that has been presented to you. And number 13, don't count on it, again, is an expression of skepticism, disbelief, and it's advice back to the person you're listening to, saying that not only do you not believe it, but you don't advise them to believe it either. Most of these expressions are based on phrasal verbs. I have packaged them in these micro stories, explanations, so that you can get access to this kind of vocabulary without having to resort to lists and memorizing vocabulary. We don't want to do that. We want things to be in context so that you can understand them still with comprehensible input. I'm recognizing that there is a problem with people learning phrasal verbs, and of course, a problem is just an unrecognized or undeveloped opportunity. And so what I'm doing with these micro stories is trying to give you access to these words with a little bit of innovation, a little bit of creativity. Certainly, I invite your comments below about this approach to this kind of vocabulary. Do you find this useful? If you like videos like this, be sure to click on this one next. See you soon.